In the interest of time, we'll circle back and settle back in. I know there's probably still some people out in line dispensing with their lunch data to be fed at lunch. But in the interest of not being too fast, I don't want to get too behind where I'd have to be dinged on being too fast or too technical, which I'm sure I tend to be. But so really the next piece, as Jeff really mentioned, is that now we're going to take a deeper dive into the data, what's available, the quality of it, and sort of how it got there, and really focus in on some epidemiology, so some basic principles of epidemiology in the context of the available data. And we're going to use as a framework for this discussion this spotlight, this stoplight as a metric to sort of showcase green, good to go, orange or yellow there. Let's talk about it. Let's really refine the question. We may have some additional things to think about and consider. And then red, as Jeff hinted, there are some things that you just kind of aren't going to be suited for Sentinel. It's important to know that up front, and we're going to have some of that discussion this morning. So as I said, works well under most circumstances possible, but warrants further discussion. And either the existing data or the existing tools or both aren't there to support addressing that research question. So really, just to pause on yellow, and what does yellow really mean? And it could be that the data is available, but there's sufficient known missingness that may cause some concern, or there's less granularity than what you would hope to take a dive into a particular data element. It may be missing over certain periods of time. It may have gotten better in more recent times. And so really, it's just a word of caution to talk about further discussion to investigate and explore if that exposure or outcome can be captured. And that's not to say that everything that's green is completely green either. I think that as we talk through some of the greens, we can highlight some potential limitations. And that's not to say that red is completely off the table, that as we talked this morning about data linkage or some of those other activities that may be able to close those gaps. So, I'm a pharmacist and an epidemiologist. I trained at the University of Pennsylvania. Brian Strom taught me very early on, what is the question? An immediate question after what is the question is, what defines the cohort? What defines exposure? What defines outcomes? What defines covariates? And so we're going to spend the rest of this morning talking through these concepts. And you can think in terms of a randomized controlled trial. You think about what defines the cohort is that inclusion and exclusion criteria that sort of gets you into a period of observation that an investigator would have. What defines exposure? Obviously, we're going to focus on medical products, so drugs, vaccines, those types of things. As a pharmacoepidemiologist, as a drug safety surveillance scientist, that is our interest. But of course, other conditions could be exposures as well. And then what defines the outcome? What is that clinical outcome of interest, and how is that operationalized in either a coding algorithm or a set of codes to define a clinical condition? And then, of course, what are the potential confounders? What might be a confounder in that association that I would want to be able to reliably measure and control for, or assess any treatment heterogeneity across different subgroups? And so again, how do I define covariates? So we'll start with this really crude Venn diagram using squares and rectangles instead of circles. So this is a little bit different. I think this is just because this is the way I think about this. What defines the cohort? What defines exposure? Those who are exposed is a subset of the cohort. Some exposed and some not exposed had a particular outcome of interest. This is a particularly big outcome. And then covariates that both happen to people in a cohort, whether they're exposed or not. And so we'll start things off with what defines a cohort. And I want to take a pause back to Jeff. One of the main things that defines a cohort is, well, eligibility at one of the data partners, right? And so many of us might have a insurance card in your wallet, and that really defines some level of cohort membership, right? Based on enrollment criteria. If I were to leave my job, I'll get a new one of these, whether I move from Boston to California or not. You know, so if I get picked up by an ambulance and taken somewhere, they're going to rifle through my wallet and take a look at this pretty quickly. So that's going to capture those medically attended events. And so I just wanted to kind of remind everybody that part of what defines the cohort is that enrollment and the curation of the data with really defined enrollment. Really defined person time is sort of an epidemiologist's dream, to have those defined enrollment periods. Now that's less so in the hospital standalone system, and we'll talk a little bit about that limitation as we go through this morning. So typically what defines a cohort, age, sex, race and ethnicity are all measured. And then of course, other inclusion and exclusion criteria that might be based on drug exposures and disease outcomes. So everything that I talk about inside the context of exposures and outcomes is also germane to the definition of what defines a cohort. But I can't put it all in one place. So bear with me this morning as we go through these concepts. So age is really important. But the Sentinel Common Data Model does not capture age. It shouldn't, because we ask it many questions a day with different index states. My age today is different than my age in September, actually in a dramatic way. I'll cross one of these chasms of cohorts, okay? In pediatric studies, age and how we define age may be of interest, right? In a pediatric study, you may be interested in age measured by days. In a toddler study, you might be interested in months. Nobody walks around today saying I'm 1,000 months old or something like that. That's a little crazy. But pediatricians, I don't know, maybe they still think that way when they go to see their physician. Sex is reliably captured, and obviously it's very rarely unpopulated, male, female, and there is obviously a category for ambiguous and unknown, although I'll note that less than 0.01% is unknown. And I'll pause just to comment that this is not a measure of gender or gender identity, that this is the sex that refers to the biology or anatomy. But again, this is highly recorded well, and I doubt that many in the room have had a mismatch in your insurance of what sex you are based on reporting at open enrollment. Now, here's our first yellow. Race and ethnicity capture may differ across data partners, and as Jeff showed in Bob's story, Kaiser knew that he was Caucasian, but Harvard Pilgrim didn't. And that just showcases the sort of separation of a more traditional claims-based data partner from an integrated delivery system that's going to have that information in an EHR. And that's not to say that some of our large data partners don't have race reliably captured as well, although this is what sort of requires some of that discussion as to does the data partner have race back to the beginning of its existence, or is it more reliably captured at a different point in time? And so that's why this is yellow, meaning it's not that it's not there, it's that there's some degree of known missingness and potential challenges with implementing specific queries by race. So some rules of thumb to cohort definitions: age reliably captured, sex is complete and reliably utilized. Race and ethnicity, there is some known data partner missingness, both in data partners that don't have it at all, to data partners that only have it during certain time periods, to other known sort of concerns that would warrant further discussion and review before implementation of a query. Okay, so inclusion and exclusion by codes, and we're going to do a deeper dive into this in the next couple of sections. But the thing to keep in mind as a question is, can the clinical concept be identified via a coding system? So for example, in identifying drug exposures, there's the national drug codes. And we're going to go through these in the next couple of slides. So I'll save some of that deeper discussion to this coding system in a moment. And then can we identify the conditions or symptoms? And we have the ICD-9 classification system, obviously post October 1st, 2015. We have the ICD-10 coding system. And what's nice about the Sentinel Common Data Model is those raw codes exist and sit extract, transformed, and loaded into the Common Data Model for routine querying. Similarly, we can identify procedures and surgeries, both using the ICD-9 coding system prior to October 1st, 2015, and ICD-10 thereafter. We also have billable codes that come in from the Healthcare Common Procedurals Coding System, or HCPCS codes. And this system also includes the Common Procedural Terminology codes, or the CPT codes. So when you go and have a surgery done or a procedure, that medically attended event is billed. Part of that bill includes this code. That code becomes an important marker for us to follow outcomes of interest, or to set up a series of inclusion or exclusion criteria. All right, so taking a step back to our square Venn diagram here, we're going to take a deeper dive into exposures with a bit more of a focus on self-administered medications and medically attended medications. And so I want to spend a minute talking about the sort of difference between self-administered medications and medically attended medications, right? So self-administered medications, as defined, dispensed by a pharmacy, taken home by a patient to be administered. So all of us, I'm sure, have been to CVS or Walgreens or Green Mountain Pharmacy or whatnot, presented our insurance card, and had a medication dispensed that we then walked away from that pharmacy with a co-payment or some level of payment by an insurance provider. We also then have medically attended medications. Those are administered by medical personnel in a healthcare facility. And so if you've been in the hospital and you have drugs administered in the hospital, those are medically attended. And so my wife is a medication safety pharmacist at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania. She is not this afternoon running up the street to CVS to fill patients' prescriptions, to generate claims, to run them in stapled bags back down to the bedside. Okay, so separating out the two broad places where medications are administered within the healthcare system. So as I mentioned, we have outpatient pharmacy dispensings. That's a green, and we'll do a deeper dive into that discussion momentarily. However, we have a red here, and one of those reds is over-the-counter products. So if you walk into a supermarket, or you even walk into a CVS and you purchase an over-the-counter aspirin or acetaminophen or ibuprofen product, and you pay cash for that prescription, that's not going to be in the insurance claim because you never presented your insurance card as part of that transaction. So that doesn't generate a claim. Now there are, and I'll do some deeper dives as far as some other potential non-billed prescriptions in a moment. Medically attended outpatient injections or infusions, this is a green. These are situations where you go to a facility and have a procedure done. And so as I already mentioned, the HCPCS and CPT codes can identify these. However, then inpatient pharmacy and injection or infusion, this is a yellow. Now we have some of our partners where there's integrated delivery with hospitals and health systems would have access to that information. Jeff also mentioned about Hospital Corporation for America as one of the EHR data partners as a standalone that would capture this information. And we'll talk more about each of these. So to spend a minute on outpatient pharmacy dispensings, I want to separate out that these are dispensings. And I want to separate out that dispensings are different than prescriptions. And I want to take a little bit of a trip back to when more paper-based systems, when a paper prescription was written by a physician with 11 refills, it was folded up, stubbed in your pocket or your purse, and brought to the pharmacy, right? The EHR system would have a record of that prescription written, but that's not as close to the patient's mouth, right? The patient has to then go to an outpatient pharmacy, present that prescription, and that prescription needs to be filled and dispensed by a pharmacist. And that dispensing then is a step, closer to the patient's mouth, as I say. And also then the pharmacy is the organization that can capture those refills. When you go back to the doctor and the doctor says, "Are you taking your medication?" and you say, "Yes," that's all the doctor has to go on, right? They don't have that you went to the pharmacy every 30 days or every 90 days to pick that up. So I wanted to separate out those concepts of dispensing and prescribing. If you can't tell, I'm a pharmacist, so I love the drug discussions. These claims are highly accurate, and it includes a national drug code. And that national drug code comes along with a dispensing date and a day supply. Even in the advent of sort of electronic prescriptions, you might have something that's sent to the pharmacy, it's filled, but it's not, while it may be billed to the insurance company, if you don't pick that up in 14 days, it's going to be reversed back out, and that claim's going to come out of the Sentinel Common Data Model, although there are potential ways to get at those data. So I want to just talk about this numeric product identifier because the NDC contains information inside the code. So the NDC is the barcode on the side of a bottle. The first 5 digits is information about the labeler. If it's a branded product, that's the manufacturer. If it's a generic product, it could be repackaged or other indications. And then the 4 digits in the middle is specific to the product, but by that manufacturer. So for example, 00006 is Merck. This is what happens when you work in codes for too long. 00002 is Lilly. And then the 4 digits in the middle indicates the drug specific to that manufacturer. And then the last 2 digits deal with the package size, whether it's a 90 count bottle or a 30 count bottle or whatnot. That NDC code then contains very rich information about the product that's being dispensed. And there's essentially virtually no error in the data entry of that because the pharmacist really likes to get paid. Real-time adjudication. Most systems have gone to barcoding. So you gun the barcode, you don't even enter it in. It manually types the NDC in the field. It gets billed in a real-time transaction. There's a handshake with the insurance company that says yes, or a PBM, pharmacy benefits manager, that says yes, I will pay for that product for that person. They are actively covered. That drug is on formulary or something that I'm willing to pay for that individual. It's within the guidelines of our medical management. And there's that handshake that goes on. And so that auditing makes this really clean and rich data, and has even increased in its the day supply field and the quantity dispensed. It used to be that the day supply field was not highly audited, but today it is. You put in a Fosamax prescription once weekly and put in 30 days, that's grounds for it being denied, because 7 times 4 is 28, not 30. So that just gives you an idea of how that data gets very rich and very curated over time. So NDCs can be associated with other product details through third-party databases, so First Data Bank, Medispan, Multum, other products that are available that can take those NDC codes and translate them into very highly curated lists of drugs. Because there can be hundreds of NDC codes for metformin, because it's a generic product that many manufacturers make, as well as many wholesalers repackage. So I just want to give a quick example of a list of some NDCs and sort of what you get. You get the generic name, the ingredient strength, and the strength unit. And that's a very important piece, that you get down to the level of the granularity of what the formulation of the product is that's dispensed. Okay, so we talked about outpatient pharmacy dispensings, highly curated, highly audited, very rich data for capturing the utilization and subsequently, for our purposes, the definition of exposures to outpatient prescriptions. Now, I had a red for over-the-counter products that I already talked about, and also other non-billed pharmacies, and so pharmacy products. So I have here an image of some of the over-the-counter products that would not be captured. I've already mentioned that. Now, there's also a category, and a lot of people ask, well, what about really inexpensive generics, $4 generics or $9 generics that I could pay cash for? Now, I'll submit that we've done some analyses to showcase that a lot of those are still there, because if you go to that same pharmacy, a busy pharmacist does not have time to sit there and go, okay, I'm going to bill this one to cash, bill this one to the insurance company, and back and forth. They're going to bill everything to the insurance company, let the insurance company chips be where they may. And so we have a lot of claims for $4 generic and $9 generics where we paid nothing, patient paid $4. We still see those claims. And those are important claims for the patient to show their out-of-pocket costs. Nothing would be worse than talking to a patient saying, well, you didn't meet your deductible. Well, you didn't bill my insurance company or let them know all of my out-of-pocket expenses. And so we actually do see a lot of these. Now, we can't control if somebody goes to a pharmacy, does not present their insurance card, and fills a prescription. Okay, so that's why that's a clear red. We're not going to get that information. Okay. So some examples: ibuprofen, naproxen, vitamins. All right, we're going to take a trip down medically attended, outpatient injection and infusion, identified through medical claims for procedures. Infusion clinics, infusion suites, they like to get paid. Insurance companies like to know what they're paying for. So again, much like the NDC discussion, this is a highly curated process. The HCPCS codes are a primary coding system to identify these injections and infusions. The codes are required for reimbursement, and there's really a high level of confidence in that accuracy from an auditing perspective. One specific category of codes is called the J codes to identify medication exposures. And there's several other coding areas that might contain medication exposures. Additionally, there are some surgical, diagnostic, and therapeutic procedures that might be of interest that might be captured through ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes. So I had this other yellow area of some specific exposures. So getting down to that brand or that dose. So unlike the NDC world, our J codes aren't specific down to that dose and formulation that was specifically administered. So the considerations here to think about is how specific the claim code is. Does it identify the brand or the dose? Now, some of this world is changing as insurers sort of mandate that an NDC come in on that J code claim line to further define that medically attended event. This area will undoubtedly improve. And so that's why this is a yellow, right? And this is going to warrant some further discussion around the definitions of what medically product exposure we're looking at. Okay, so outpatient treatment should be captured due to the payment requirements because of the dependency on the coding for reimbursement is reliably captured. There are some delays in coding assignments. So a lot of times a new product will come to the market and it uses a non-specific J code until it gets its own J code. That can cause some of that yellowness that we were talking about before around how to accurately define a particular exposure. So just some examples: HPV-9 vaccine, contraceptive injections, et cetera. So there's lots of opportunities for capturing in claims most outpatient exposures. And as I already mentioned, that these inpatient exposures are not well captured. So inpatient dispensings are not captured on claims because that entire hospital encounter is rolled up into a series of claims that don't get down to that level of granularity. So for example, those inpatient pharmacies or Pyxis machines or Omnicell machines that sit up on the floors inside hospitals that nurses are grabbing medications out of and recording in medication administration records in an inpatient setting, they're not coming out as part of the claim into the insurance system. So again, as I stated, due to the aggregation of inpatient care into a claim, some treatments are submitted though and coded separately. So for example, very expensive treatments may then be billed out separately. And so this is again where this might be yellow, where we can talk further about what is that specific exposure of interest, and is there a way to get at that? Very similar to our outpatient story of infusions and injections that we just talked about. Okay, so some highlights to medically attended inpatient exposures. We do have 16 data partners that are integrated or have that integrated data. So for example, the Kaiser system, particularly the Kaiser system in Northern California that actually owns their hospitals, they might have that deeper data. But again, it's a smaller population. And so that's where this is one of those situations where it's a yellow and there's going to be some variability across data partners. And then we have one data partner that, as Jeff mentioned, is a hospital EHR data partner. And we may very well be able to get at exposures that are captured, particularly using some of these internal hospital coding systems to really get at detailed product information that would be available. But again, then the limitation with working with a hospital-based data partner is if you're looking at events that occur 30 or 60 days out that would have occurred outside that health system, that's not going to be a question that can be addressed. Okay, so at one place where this has been done in the hospital EHR environment is medically attended inpatient exposures for blood systems, blood products, and platelets. So taking a look at what platelets might look like in claims, it's just at this high level HCPCS CPT code basis. And so it's not specific to the specific intercept blood system or definitions of the granularity of defining the platelet product. However, in the EHR system that utilizes CODA-BAR, which is older, or ISBT 128 coding systems, you may really get at that level of granularity of what that product was and be able to follow those people at least over the duration of the time that they are in an inpatient setting. Okay, and this is just further information on how hierarchical this is to get down to exactly what types of ISBT codes ultimately get in and are available to determine whether things are apheresis or riboflavin treatment, et cetera. And even more detail about these codes, which I won't spend any more time really diving into today, other than to say that there is detailed data in an inpatient setting, but again, that's often uncoupled from the detailed data that we have in a longitudinal outpatient setting. And just as a piece, Jeff mentioned some of the expansion and where things are going. So inpatient pharmacy data will be available from Hospital Corporation of America, and that will get at records of medications dispensed and administered. It will be limited information during that particular visit. And that data is under review and is currently undergoing characterization. Okay, so some rules of thumb. Self-administered medications, outpatient pharmacy dispensings, well captured. Medically attended outpatient injections and infusions, well captured, although be aware of some of the granularity issues with regards to the coding system that's utilized. Self-administered over-the-counter products or cash-paid prescriptions that people did while they were on vacation and didn't even show their insurance card. This is if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's around to watch it, did it happen? It's hard for an insurer to know what happened if it wasn't part of a medically attended bill. Inpatient time available in our EHR data partner, potentially available in some of our integrated delivery systems, but not available in our large claims partners. Okay, what defines outcome? This is where we spend a lot of time. And one of the strengths of Sentinel is its ability, given that it is identifiable data, and it's not sitting in one database, it's sitting at several databases. We can go back to source records for many of our members and patients and request medical charts to do validation studies. And there have been a series of validation studies that have been done on certain outcomes, and those could be planned for future activities. Things to think about. Does the condition require medical attention? You know, the rash that I have that I don't go to seek medical care isn't going to come to the attention of the healthcare system. It's not going to generate a EHR visit. It's not going to generate an administrative claim. One needs to think about the acute and chronic presentation of disease. Recognize that as we talked about Bob's story, if you need to find incident hypertension patients, he's only going to be eligible for that incident hypertension inside the Harvard Pilgrim system. When Bob gets to Kaiser and immediately starts having hypertension diagnoses, you know, that's not going to be incident. So a lot of times we build into our queries, and we'll talk about that in this afternoon, a look back period to build a period of covariance. So I say this all the time, the most understudied population in America today, observationally, is the 65 to 65 and a half year old. Because you're tracking along in commercial insurance, you retire, or you're in a pension plan or something, and you reach Medicare age and you enter fee-for-service Medicare. And those first 6 months, the academics that are out there buying it through NIH grants and others buying Medicare data, they have to use that first 6 month period as a baseline period, right, to exclude patients who have prevalent conditions if they're studying a particular condition of interest. One to consider about diagnostic tests and procedures, we'll get into that. We'll also get into treatments. Sometimes treatments can be used as part of your coding algorithms and definitions. And the beauty here is Sentinel has access to these records that are associated with these patient-clinician interactions over a defined period of time. Okay, similar to exposures, we're going to separate outcomes into not medically attended and medically attended. The outcomes that are medically attended are reported to or observed by a clinician, documented in the medical record. Those clinicians and providers seek reimbursement and generate a bill. Not medically attended, those are outcomes that are not reported or observed. So nosebleeds, headaches, sunburn, not going to be in your database. Now, if it's a sunburn that is severe enough that warrants an ED visit or something, it's going to be there. So, you know, obviously, serious events will rise to the attention of medically attended. And certain cases, some of the nosebleeds in some of our populations may very often rise to medical attention. And so those would be there. So again, while this is red, you want to think about that underlying cohort. Just a bit about medically attended codes and the ICD-9 and the ICD-10 system. So ICD-9 has been phased out. There's some really good data to start showing how that it was a faucet. We turned off ICD-9, we turned on ICD-10. It is amazing what happens when you tell providers on October 1st, you will use ICD-10 or I will not pay. Lo and behold, ICD-10, very in, clean, no more ICD-9. And so ICD-10 though does have a lot more granularity. Diagnoses that are coded under ICD-10 use 3 to 7 digits instead of the 3 to 5 that were used with ICD-9. This just shows some difference. I could probably spend an entire hour just on ICD-10. We will probably do some ICD-10 deeper dives in future trainings and those types of things. You know, ICD-9, you had no laterality. In ICD-10, you have this right and left, and as a matter of fact, it accounts for over 40% of the codes. So for example, if you broke your right arm, and that was one of your outcomes was fracture, and you know, a couple weeks later you had because you had your right arm broke, you broke your left arm because you were using it too much or you slipped and fell. Now you can see, that's not a follow-up visit for that fracture, right? So that level of granularity opens up doors to being able to do some more characterization of events. I think there were some other areas to highlight. Yes, the number of codes, right? 14,000 codes in ICD-9, almost 70,000 codes in ICD-10. Again, about 40% of that is with this increase in the laterality. All right, medically attended outcomes. These come in two flavors: acute onset and chronic. So acute onset, clear diagnostic criteria. You know, is there clear diagnostic criteria? And if there is, then coding systems can reliably identify that. So an acute myocardial infarction has clear diagnostic criteria. Coding systems are well adept at being able to identify those. Coding systems that may not identify certain conditions, for example, Stevens-Johnson syndrome or some specific conditions that don't have clear coding rules. Now, some of this is changing with the advent of ICD-10. So this is sort of a watch this space, because some of this may improve over time as the advent of ICD-10 is fully implemented and adopted. And so really one needs to think about the ability of that outcome using the coding rules in Sentinel. And that often requires some degree of prep work or investigation work upfront, typically reviewing the literature as well as some preliminary queries. Okay, so then there are delayed outcomes or delayed onset or uncertainties in the onset. So for example, the potential for medication-associated outcomes that are expected to occur months or years after the exposure are really difficult to assess. So my extreme case on this is, what about exposures to, let's say, pediatric antibiotics and the outcome of prostate cancer? You know, is Sentinel a good place to do that? Well, no, right? Because typically you're not with the same insurance provider from you know, birth to retirement age, right? Because of the longitudinality. And so making a connection between exposure and an outcome many years later is complex. Knowledge of disease progression may limit the observation until at concrete diagnosis, right? So a lot of times there's, you know, you're being worked up for a given clinical condition. So it's not like you wake up one morning, today's the day I'm going to have diabetes, right? So there may be a series of encounters that that need to sort of crescendo into a defined outcome. Okay, so I already mentioned this, that the conditions with long latency periods limit analysis due to churn with data partners. So there's sort of 4 or so reasons why you may leave a insurance provider. Jeff mentioned one: when Bob changed jobs. Not only did Bob change jobs, he moved across the country. Now, I'm at HealthCore, we have the Anthem data. If somebody changes jobs from one employer to another, but happens to stay within Anthem, that's linkable. That's linkable. Even if they move from Virginia to California, that is linkable. But you know, there's other reasons why you might change. Your employer may no longer offer that plan. You may get married and choose to go onto a spouse's plan. And so there's a couple other different reasons why folks may leave their insurance partner. I already mentioned retiring or aging into Medicare. However, as Jeff mentioned, some of these limitations can be overcome with study design. So through case control or self-controlled designs that we can get around some of these aspects for certain conditions. And then uncertain diagnostic criteria. So again, this is where things get particularly challenging. And I already mentioned things like Stevens-Johnson syndrome and some other places. Acute liver failure is another example. that may be difficult to identify and diagnose. If they're difficult to identify and diagnose for the clinician, they're also going to be difficult to identify reliably within administrative data. And so clinicians do not consistently diagnose some conditions due to that uncertainty in diagnostic criteria. This is where the art of medicine reaches the science of medicine, right? And so we need to think about well-considered criteria to identify these conditions or combine certain criteria as needed, often with a diagnosis plus a treatment to sort of get at that confirmation of the clinical condition. Backing up to some special outcome considerations within Hospital Corporation of America, some future expansion of the data model, being able to capture specific diagnosis dates, as well as sort of procedural dates and procedural times. These elements are not reliable inside claims-based partners, inside an outpatient outcome where things may be rolled up into a single claim or a series of claims over a hospital period. All right, so just to conclude, rules of thumb on outcome. Really need to think about defining the outcome prior to sort of peeking into the data, right? But understanding that the data can also be utilized from a perspective of what's available and how reliably it is there. And so often conducting a outcomes validation study is warranted to showcase the validity of a particular algorithm. But I will note that acute onset events with clear diagnostic criteria, which is a vast majority of clinical conditions that we are interested in from a drug safety perspective, are readily available. Okay, what defines covariate? So what's sort of left? Now, obviously, anything that I described already up to this point could be a covariate of interest. There could be other drugs that are covariates of interest. So go back to the discussion on what defines an exposure. That's going to help define other drug covariates that one would want to potentially adjust for in an analysis. Additionally, what defines outcome? How I define an outcome and how I define a clinical condition is also vital for defining covariates and those types of things. Much like I mentioned in the cohort, what defines an inclusion or exclusion criteria if it deals with drug exposures or clinical outcomes, that information is germane to what defines a cohort. So some additional covariates that we'll spend some time in here is medical history or comorbidities and treatment history. And that is very green, and we'll go over that in just a minute. Now, some lifestyle factors are not processed as part of administrative claims and are not reliable. So if you want to adjust for certain things that might only be available on somebody's Facebook feed, that's not reported to the insurance company, right? So again, think back to how this data got curated, right, in the first place. What was important in that patient-clinician encounter, and then what of that patient-clinician encounter was important for the reimbursement of that encounter. Clinical laboratory data, Jeff mentioned laboratory test results and vital signs, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. So looking at our lab data, Jeff mentioned that it was a subset of the laboratory data that's available. This is 16 laboratory tests that have been highly curated. There are some manuscripts that are out there from Sentinel, specifically documenting those curation steps. I can say that as some of the large data partners, ourselves included, do have access to lab data. One of the reasons why this is yellow is, do we have access to all lab data? Well, no. So I never know if I can actually say what our two lab data partners are that we at Anthem have access to lab data. But they're the two white buckets that sit outside most physicians' offices in the United States. One is stamped and the other is stamped, right? So if you're confused, ask me at the break and I'll tell you what those two lab data partners are, or go to the next time you go to the doctor, look at those two white boxes that are sitting out there. Now, often there might be a blue or a green box in the middle of those two boxes. That's the local hospital or health system, right? Well, those labs aren't going to be part of our data environment. Now, other data partners may have those data and not some of the other large data partners. So, you know, we have lab data. Is it complete? Probably not, but for certain conditions like glucose, hemoglobin A1C, those types of things, we're going to have the vast majority of those labs, right? Okay, so I already mentioned this. There's variability in the sources of laboratory results data. There are internal standalone laboratory information systems. There are large national laboratory systems. And obviously that level of variability needs to be thought of as these studies are planned. The completeness of a population with accessible test results, the calendar years that data may be complete is all something to consider. And what the Sentinel system has done through its process of highly curating this data, there are characterization reports on all of these laboratory results and across the different data partners. Okay, so some takeaway messages, right? Most outpatient exposures are reliably captured. Claims data is just that. It is medically attended events where in the context of the healthcare system, the patient and the insurance company are in a collaboration with the payment for those services. That generates reliable information over a defined longitudinal period of time. Most acute onset outcomes are reliably captured, provided that there is that clear diagnostic criteria. And I think that clear diagnostic criteria is somewhat in the eye of the beholder, and I think that's what's important, that we, as a community, have access to the scientific expertise at the data partners, as well as the scientific expertise at some of our other partners, to really untangle and get very close to the data to understand these coding systems and how they can be utilized to distinguish various outcomes. Over-the-counter medications are not well captured. Inpatient treatment requires further discussion. If the event of interest is going to occur over a short period of time, the EHR data partner may be a very suitable environment to address that research question. If the event of interest is going to occur outside that system, that's going to be requiring further discussion. If there's the need for the granularity of inpatient exposure and outpatient events, that we're going to have to sort of dig deep into how that question could be answered. Again, non-medically attended events, much like over-the-counter medications, not well captured. Okay, that, I hope you don't all ding me for going too fast, but that opens up more opportunity for questions in advance of lunch. Okay, so great question. So the question is, are we going to run out of, or when we run out of NDC codes, how will we handle that? And is there a future direction of mapping to RX norm? So yeah, I have not run the permutations and combinations analysis to figure out exactly when we'll run out of NDC codes. We do, through those lookup tables, have obsolete dates and dates that things change. So should that day come, we will be able to put into place that ability to say, okay, during this time period, this NDC code represented this. And during this time period, this NDC code represented this. Right now, I have only found one NDC code that represented both tampons decades ago and now Ondansetron or something, I don't know. So can it happen? Yes, but because of the lookup tables, that would be a nightmare situation for a payer. Immediately, we would have to change the game if there's going to be an NDC code that is uniquely instantiating two products simultaneously in a period of time. As a payer, I'm not going to know what I'm reimbursing, right? So we would see a sea change overnight in what would need to happen for that to happen. So as of right now, there are no plans to sort of map to RX norm because of that curation process right now. The NDC is as close can be to the source population or the source data, right? It is what the pharmacist pulled off the shelf and barcode scanned and handed to the patient. And so because it has that level of granularity and that level of tiedness to the claim, it's still extremely valuable for us as we characterize the exposure within cohorts. Does that help? We'll handle that through appropriate lookup tables with the obsolete codes. Reusing is less of an issue. Two NDC codes, NDC code out there instantiating two products is going to be a nightmare situation and would require immediate changes to the way we as a business operate and reimburse pharmacies for care. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, given the changes to the healthcare system and some of the modifications into covered lives situation where there may be less incentives to bill because things are sort of, well, I'm paying you this pot of money to just take care of this patient, more of a capitated type system or environment. What are our plans? I can't say that we have any direct plans for sea change in that direction. Ideally, that in those situations where things move in that direction of a more value-based or capitated type system, that then a large insurer for those members that they're saying, okay, I am paying this to cover that. I'm going to need to see EHR data or some degree of integrated data to know that I'm getting and deriving that value. And so I actually see that as an opportunity to move more into the integrated lives story. But yes, watch this space. You know, even a Kaiser patient who goes on vacation to Chicago where there is no Kaiser and has an event, that encounter is occurring as a administrative claim. And so for now, I think that level of fragmentation, but yet still saying, well, I'm going to pay for this with my insurer is going to help protect against that and provide an opportunity for us to continue to do the research that we're doing. Does that help? Okay, wait, I have a question online and then I'll come back to the audience. All right, so what triggers a registration of a specific patient population? Okay. It's tough to not have the person here to engage in some one-on-one to know what registration really means. But patients register with a insurance provider at the time of open enrollment or employment. We also then may define specific cohorts that say, you know, once you've had an acute myocardial infarction, that registers you in this myocardial infarction cohort that I'm interested in, and you become eligible for that cohort, that defining event would, quote unquote, register you for a population. So I hope that that helps the member on there. I'm going to go to the audience. Okay. Yeah, so the question is specific around, are there specific outcomes that may end up getting covered by workman's comp or car accident type insurance providers that would then not generate the claims inside a insurer? We've had some discussion on this, certainly aware of it, and certainly it's all part of when one thinks about the outcome, to think through all of those different types of scenarios that may occur. Much like the system where a patient might go to the pharmacy and pick up a $4 generic and the insurance company doesn't pay anything, that still generates a claim. A lot of times when you first hit that door of the ED, it's your insurance company that's getting billed first. Now they may then go, oh, wait, this isn't us because there's somebody else that can pay for this because of some other contractual or legal obligation. But that still generated that information, that claim. That insurance provider still knows about that. It is very rare for people, if not impossible, if not fraud, to have two insurance providers at the same time. I can't be covered on Aetna and Anthem at the same time. But your point is valid in thinking through, for some conditions, there may be other places that, other payers that aren't part of the patient's insurance provider. But I think that given the way the healthcare system works, a lot of those claims still get picked up by the primary, meaning your primary insurance. And then either the primary insurance bills the secondary for that encounter, or there's at least the generation of the claim that still indicates that that event occurred. Does that help address that question? It's a good question. It's very outcome specific as you get into some specific outcomes that might be interesting. So great question. So the question is regarding self-administered pharmacy claims. There are individuals that that may have medical only, and their pharmacy benefit is from some other provider. In our enrollment table, we have a start and a stop date for medical and pharmacy. And so most of our studies, we're interested in the defined cohort is those that have both medical and pharmacy. And so there is a large population within some of the data partners that have medical only. They're going to be removed from a lot of our self-administered pharmacy studies because so that goes back to that cohort definition. When I talked about cohort defining and I immediately pulled out the insurance card, I probably should have pulled out both insurance cards to say that what's of interest to Sentinel is the time that they are both medical, and pharmacy covered for exactly that purpose. One of the strengths of the administrative data is that defined period of time, so that you know, hey, even though this person hasn't been exposed, if they were exposed, I would know about it. You know, this drug is $3,000 a month. If they were on it, I would know about it. Does that help? Right. Okay. So the question is using ICD-9 and ICD-10 to define specific inclusion criteria, although it's germane to outcome as well. Any information or data around the implications of the sensitivity and specificity of those codes to define various conditions. So there's been it's a great question. There's been a series of both curated papers and an online sort of dictionary of available sensitivities and specificities of known coding algorithms that Sentinel has used. That's available on the Sentinel website. There's also been a series of specific Sentinel chart validation studies, which has actually gotten at the sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value. From an analytic perspective, you're absolutely right that those sensitivities and specificities could be built into different models to sort of do additional modeling of outcomes. I don't know that any work has been done specifically in that. There has been work done by Sasha Dublin and some other investigators that looked at sort of a two-phase approach to say, okay, this is where I can identify the outcomes in the claims, but then among some of that group, I know that I can get access to this deeper data. And so utilizing a two-phased approach to then showcase how those different criteria and the sensitivities and specificities would model up into the rest of the cohort. So can it be done? Yes. Are the tools completely available to do all of those micro things? I would say watch this space. Can it be done? Yes. Is there full tool implementation for it? Not at this time. Yes. Okay, so the question is around how do we identify new users of a medical product to then follow them forward in time for outcomes of interest? It's a great question. So again, with the defined enrollment period, what we typically do, and Judy will talk about this in detail in the afternoon, is we look for that first exposure following enrollment, and we look for a sufficient baseline period in the past. And typically that's set at a year, sometimes it's set at 6 months. That's a proxy for new use. You're absolutely right that I could give my kids today every drug that's available for an afternoon, and they'll never be a new user again in the future. So you're right that somebody who used metformin 3 years ago, and now I see they're in a database for 6 months and they start taking metformin, I may call them a new user based on the best information that I have available. But if they went that period of time without metformin, to me that is new use at that point. It is a limitation of the fragmentation of the United States healthcare system to get at your specific question. Again, back to my example of 65, you hit that wall at 65, you join, go out and pull the literature of your Medicare studies and see how many people they drop in the consort diagram figure 1 because they were already exposed to aromatase inhibitors, right, for breast cancer. That's how hopefully many people get identified as being prevalent breast cancer treated patients, is they're on long-term therapy like that. So it's a challenge. The tools utilize the best approach possible to be able to set an index date and say, at least over this last period, you didn't use, this drug, and so you're a new user, right? And in a diabetic population, if I'm an insulin user, it's not like I'm going to go a year without insulin. So I'm pretty reliable on this is a new user of insulin. Does that help? Okay, so we have a question from the WebEx. CPT procedure codes are used for inpatient administration claims. CPT codes are used for outpatient setting. So for inpatient, is CPT mandatory or optional? Okay, so again, this is one of those places where it's going to be a yellow circle that's going to require further discussion. So are CPT codes mandatory on an inpatient setting? Well, true that in a rolled up DRG or diagnostic related group coding system for a particular encounter, vancomycin 1 gram Q12 on 5 South may be super cheap, part of routine hospital care, and the healthcare system is not individually billing that J code to the insurance company, right? But particularly costly products that, in order to warrant reimbursement of the healthcare system, require that CPT code, then yes, it's going to be there. So this is a place to get focused and have really detailed discussions about that medical product exposure with the operations center, which can then further direct those questions to data partners and potentially run some summary table queries to see the prevalence of those codes in the different data environments. So I hope that helps. Yeah. Okay, great question. So the question is around the data refreshing and whether or not the entire database is refreshed or it's only incremental. And if the entire database is refreshed, what implications that might have for safety surveillance of outcomes that may or may not still remain in the database over a long period of time as things are replaced or refreshed. Great question. So I'm at Health Corps. We have access to Anthem data. We do 4 refreshes a year. I don't know, we're on like ETL 19 or something at this point. The entire data environment is refreshed. And so, there is the potential of what we call this sort of 85% claims capture rate. So now we're going to get in the weeds here for just a minute. Pharmacy systems, pharmacists like to get paid before you leave the store, okay? So our data, and as a matter of fact, for a project that we're running, we pulled as fresh data as we possibly could. We have claims data from pharmacy feeds that are really fresh. They're as fresh as last week or at least last month, right? For our medical side, because it's it just showcases on the card, bill the patient $10. Great. I take my $10 as a provider for an outpatient visit. I'm going to roll up a claim on the 15th or the 30th of the month. These things can lag through negotiation. So yes, some events may change and as the claims sort of what we call sort of settle into those final claims. That is the nature of the data. it is indicative that it is always perceived that the newer data is that source of truth. So if events do go away, if you will, that's because they maybe that was Bob Smith that got billed for that. That was incorrect. Well, you would want that data curated to go away. So from that perspective, data is refreshed back to the beginning, at least for what we do at Health Corps. Does that sort of help address that question? Way more to come after lunch, and a lot more deeper dive into the tools. So everything that we talked about this morning is sort of going to become real world application in the afternoon through some pretty specific examples that Judy has pulled out. So if you have further questions around lunch, Jeff and I are available to address some questions, and thank you for the opportunity.